Okay.
Always starting on time, and maybe I could get your attention, please. Okay. Yes, it's really fantastic to have Rebeca Wong here, who has a long history with Penn also, and Mexican health and aging study that I just realized the first wave was in 2001, and it seems like it was yesterday, so it's amazing how fast that time goes. And they've already finished 4 waves and 5th in the field. But anyway, Rebeca is really an outstanding scholar who works on economic consequences of population aging using data from Mexico, but also many of the sister studies with sort of the HRS and other sister studies. She's made big contributions to understanding comparisons, also American population in the US and in Mexico, and trying to understand the linkages between health and migration, and whether contributing to that literature as well as many literatures on less developed country aging. But some of the work that she's doing now overlaps with some of our students, which is pollution, air pollution, internal and cognitive aging, which she, I'm sure, will mention today. And it's also great to know that she's collaborating with 2 of our former students. Hiram Beltran Sanchez is a co-investigator on the MHAS project now, and she just told me she's starting to work on a paper with Colin Penny. So see all these connections. So think about how you might be able to use these data, and welcome, Rebeca. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be back. We can't remember when was the last time I came in person, but it was a while back. So it's good. Since we see each other so much, the colleagues, professors and I see each other in meetings, conferences, we forget when we last saw each other here. But in any event, thank you for the invitation. I really am very excited to talk to you all about this. As Irma was saying, I've collaborated through the years with people, graduates from here, colleagues from here, so it's great to be back. So as usual these days, when I give a talk about this study, I'm hoping that some of you, many of you, will get excited about the data and the topics and will want to at least think about it and use them. So the brief outline of what I thought I would do is give you a brief background, since it's a colloquium on aging and population, the brief background on aging in Mexico. And then that's how that's the genesis of the study, how it came to be, what were the motivation aspects of the moments when we were thinking about launching the study, how it was designed, and then how it's changed, which I think is the most exciting part for us looking back. I never imagined that it was going to take the shape that it has taken, but it has to do with the way the field of aging has evolved too. Then the subsamples have taken a lot of value in this study, and so we do a lot of that, and I'll tell you a little bit on some of the subsamples, a little of the potential of the study, the impact has been used, how it's being used, and what are the research opportunities that we see at this moment for young people or established investigators, and also the future plans of the study. It's nice to go out and talk about a study that has a future, so it's nice to talk to you about those plans. So the background, briefly, the magnitude of aging. So in 2015, which is the last intercensus count that was taken in Mexico, the population 60 and older was about 12 million, which is about 10% of the total population in Mexico, which is 125 million. But what is interesting is not the size, actually. So as many of you know, it's the pace of aging that's sweeping Latin America, which is the next continent that's aging right now with the fastest speed, is the speed in which it's happening. And as you also know, as demographers, it's just a consequence of the speed that the drop in mortality and the drop in fertility took. So it was so fast compared to what other countries did, that then it's just as a consequence, the happy consequence of that speed and drop in fertility and mortality is that we get fast aging. So just to give an example of the rapid pace, the proportion of population 65 and older in Mexico, it took about 26 to 30 years to go from 6% to 15%. So it's going to be projected to be 15% in the year 2036. And compare that to the time it took other countries to go from 6 to 15%. The US took about 69 years. France took about 115 years. So it's just, again, it just reflects that speed in mortality and fertility, which means that Mexico is going to age or is aging at a much compressed and fast pace. And it's the same to the rest of most of the rest of Latin America. So here I'm showing just in 2030 some of the projections in Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Brazil are going to be aging faster or higher proportions than Mexico. But the whole continent is sweeping. Cuba is one of the countries with the highest percentage of old population. So it's a very interesting case that if we got to study would be very interesting. But so I was saying the aging is just sweeping the Latin American region. Now, what's unique about aging in Mexico is then it's aging with low social and economic development levels compared to those countries that age first. Europe, think Japan, think the US. The level of economic development is much lower. And in particular, think of that the current elderly, those who are alive in places like Mexico, have survived infectious diseases in their childhood. So they have the same body then manifested or experience infectious diseases in childhood and then are going to manifest or present chronic diseases in old age. And they're going to have then a mixed regime of both infectious and chronic conditions. And this is what sold the study for us. There was a new environment of aging, a new population that we got to study. And so this is basically what motivated this longitudinal study. So the question is, compared with developed countries that age under those conditions of higher socioeconomic development, lower pace, slower pace, and that didn't have this regime of infections and chronic in the same life cycle, how is old age going to manifest? Is it going to be healthier because you survive all those things? So maybe when you're old age and survive, you're healthier. Or it could be less healthy because you survive all those things and you're in poverty and so on, inequality. So maybe you're weaker and you will be in old age more deteriorated. But there's survival issues as well. As I said, you survived. So who survived depends on who survived. All of these patterns are unknown. And that's why I said motivated the fact that we can come up and say, let's study a country like Mexico, which in addition has been having very close ties with the United States historically. So it makes sense to study aging. So way back in the 1997, 1998, we started talking about starting a prospective longitudinal study of aging in Mexico. We had the blueprints of the U.S. Health and Retirement Study that started in 1992, and part of the history that Irma was alluding to that we have with Penn is that Beth Soldo was at University of Pennsylvania and was a PI of the first wave of the study back in 1997, 98 when we started thinking about it. So what we decided it would be like I said, very similar to the health and retirement study in the US. It covers sociodemographic characteristics, health in multiple dimensions, chronic diseases, infectious diseases, physical disability, chronic diseases, as I said, functionality and cognitive aging as well, cognitive function. Depression is in there. Family and social networks, it was very important for developing countries to measure family and social networks. Migration experiences, again, for Mexico, whether the person was ever a migrant and is now back in Mexico, and whether their family and children are in the US or are back in Mexico. The help that they give to their children and parents, the help they receive. Economic data, of course, because again, it's very similar to the health and retirement study. We had to have sources of income, types of assets, pensions plan to receive or receiving, work history and current employment, dwelling characteristics of the dwelling. Like I said, it's going to be very interesting and important for environmental health. The attitudes about health, economic status, power to make decisions. And this is something that the field of aging evolved, as I was saying. Psychosocial measures became much more important. Starting around 2003, 2005, they were pushing a lot of psychosocial aspects, attitudes, and impressions. Widowhood and the last year of life has always been of interest of aging, so this was part of the content. Some other variables that I wanted to highlight. Of course, we wanted to understand childhood conditions in order to explain the life course and the consequences in old age, living conditions in childhood, as well as health conditions in childhood. And we look at the social network, as I said, and the children's network to see where they reside, even if they don't reside with them, where they are. If they are in the US in particular, we want to know. And if they reside in Mexico, in what community, how often they see them, how often they talk to them. Healthcare expanding, out-of-pocket payments. It's going to be important in a little while when I tell you what happened in Mexico. Time use is in there. Subjective measures such as satisfaction with life, as I said, perceptions of family health, personality traits, locus of control, loneliness, and power to make decisions. So I'm highlighting here some of the aspects that will come up later as interesting. So what did we do? We decided way back in 1999 that we would do a baseline study. We'll take people 50 years and older with national representation, a sample in Mexico, and that will represent both urban and rural areas with, like I said, all the content that I mentioned. And it was funded by the NIA at the beginning, part of the NIH, the National Institute on Aging. And it was, like I said, designed to be highly comparable to the HRS in the US. There's an oversample in communities, or 6 of the states actually, with high migration to the United States in order to find enough return migrants and be able to study the consequences of international migration in old age. The first 2 waves were done in 2001 and 2003. At the baseline, we took households, about 11,000 households with at least one person, but you interview the person and the spouse. Whether the spouse is 50 or older or not, doesn't matter. You take the spouse. The 2 of them are followed until death. That's the protocol. We were fortunate enough that the fieldwork is completed by INEGI, which is the Statistical Bureau in Mexico, the institution that does censuses and surveys and vital registration and satellite images and so on. And so we did the baseline in 2001, and 2 years later, we followed in 2003. If the person has died, then we conduct a proxy interview, so that's a next of kin interview after the death. It's about an 80-minute interview face-to-face. At the moment, in 2001 and 2003, they were all paper and pencil. And we took a subsample to get objective measures in those 2 surveys for anthropometrics, such as height, weight, waist, hip, 1-foot balance. This helps a lot, and you'll see some of the research that's done is comparing the self-report. When somebody tells you, I measure 5'4", and in the subsample, we measure the person, we weigh the person, and so you are able to assess the self-reports a lot with these subsamples. And if somebody can tell you, well, I cannot walk, but you see them 1-foot balance and they can stand, so you kind of evaluate a little bit of the self-report. Then that happened in 2001, 2003. Like I said, we went into hiatus. The study then stopped, paused, and we were analyzing the 2 waves of data. But then something happened in Mexico. There were a lot of interesting reforms that happened that kind of made us think whether we wanted to go back and take the cohort again. So what happened was that in this period, very close to 2003, the healthcare reform started in Mexico. There's a move to universal healthcare, and so it's called Seguro Popular. And so it was implemented gradually, but it started around here, so very much. So by 2012, pretty much they claim that most older adults are covered. So healthcare reform happened. Old age pension reform also happened in this period. The 70 and older population started receiving pensions, also gradually introduced. There was an economic recession in 2009. The 2008 recession happened in the US and it hit Mexico in 2009. And there's also a well-known contraction of Mexico-US migration that happened around here, 2009, 2010. And so all these things happened. So by 2010, we said, you know what, there's enough going on, and we have the before, and we can have the after observations on the same subjects and see the effect of these things. So that's when we revived the cohort, or we tried to revive the cohort. We had to convince someone, the funders, that we could do it, that after 9 years we could contact enough people to make it a worthwhile endeavor. And so we conducted a pilot with INEGI in Mexico, and it was convincing enough that we got funding to reestablish the study. But we were very nervous in 2012. After we came back from the field, we wanted to know, did we get it? Did we reestablish the study? So fortunately, it was pretty good. And so the recontact rates, I'm going to show you a little bit of that. So in the next cycle of funding, we were funded to do the 2012. And after we were convinced that this was a successful endeavor, we decided to conduct the study for every 3 years from then on. Half budget, half logistics, and it was just too much every 2 years. So we decided we'll do it 2012, and then 2015, and then 2018, and then 2021. So those are the plans. And now you see, we also added new sample in 2012, and we decided when we would add new sample every 6 years. So every other wave. We will refresh the sample that was aged, so we will fill the years that were empty. In this case, the 50 to 61s are re-added, and then in the next wave in 2018, we'll add the 50 to 55s, that are the ages that are empty. So we added new sample, and we moved the study to copy. So remember, it was paper and pencil. In 2012, we said we would move it all to copy. By then, the Statistical Bureau in Mexico was conducting their censuses and surveys, some of them with copy, and they said, yeah, let's move it all. We also, in 2012, added a subsample for blood samples. The field, again, had moved enough so that we were convinced that we needed to do some blood samples. And so that meant we organized a second visit as a follow-up in a subsample. We had high response rates, and this is credit all to INEGI, because the strategy that they decided to implement was to sweep the whole follow-up sample, and look for them before the interviewers came, so to the household. So they had to go and try to locate them. If they had moved, they had to say, where have they moved? Locate the next residents, the new residents. If they had died, okay, who's going to give me the interview on the death? On the deceased, and then they would go and find the address of that person and go and find the person and say, okay, in 3 weeks or to 5 weeks, they're going to come back and get you in an interview. So that preliminary visit really paid off for the response rate in the follow-up. So just here, just follow the response rate. So at the beginning, we had a response rate of 92%. In the next 2 years follow-up was 93%. And so over here, we were expecting 70%, and we got 88%, so we were very pleased with that. INEGI was not pleased. INEGI wanted 90%, but we're pleased with 88%. And so we've been followed. The 2015 also was an 88% follow rate. So which is a very favorable rates compared to other countries, in particular the US. So we were very pleased with that, which just means that the Mexican population is not as mobile after age 50. But also that INEGI did a great effort on locating people. And now what I'm going to highlight in the next 4 waves in the next slide is the next of kin interviews. So these are that by this wave, 2 years later, 546 had died. So we interviewed a relative. By this other wave, another 2,700 had died, and we interviewed a relative. And this one, another 1,200, and we interviewed a relative. So now you have 4,500 deaths. And you have the interview a long time, but also the interview of the next of kin as a post-mortem. And so what you got is a very powerful study of mortality in the last year of life when you have enough numbers. And I know we don't want people to die, but the mortality people, Idam and those people are very excited. Oh yeah, we have more. And so the sample size increased and increased, so that just powers the study of mortality. And so overall, when you look at the 4 waves that we conducted from 2001 to 2005, there are people in the data sets that have 4 interviews, 8,000, people with 3, people with 2, people with 1, and out of, like I said, the disease that you have interviewed with a next of kin is 4,500. The sample is distributed all across all 32 states in Mexico. At the beginning, this was seen as, from our perspective, this is very expensive. The more disperse the sample, the more expensive it is, because you have to go and locate more people in more locations. But when we look back, it was a great strategy, right, to have sample in all 32 states, because it doesn't matter if somebody moves from Campeche to Baja California Norte, because the fieldwork people are in all 32 at the same time. So you just say, you know what, this case goes there, okay, they take it and they go there. And it's a very, I say it easily, but they have to do it. But once the whole surveys in the field, it's great to be able to follow people. And this study is conducted in 10 precious weeks. In 10 precious weeks, they interview 15,000 people all across the country. So next, I'm going to focus a little bit on this subsample. So now the studies become a study of the way the cohort is being followed across waves and across time, but we also have become a study of subsamples. And so in these, like I said, you measure them and weigh them and so on. But in wave 3, we got blood samples, which is the most interesting part of here, and performance measures. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then I'm going to talk about this other subsample, that we took a subsample in 2015, and we got a detailed cognition performance measures and anthropometrics. So it's the detailed cognition, it was an important content there, and here it was the biomarkers. So for those of you who are interested, biomarkers became one of the components of social surveys, and so now we call them biosocial surveys. And we become one of those. We have intravenous blood, and what we did with that blood was to get CRP protein for inflammation. We got cholesterol, total, and HDL-C, thyroid hormone, vitamin D, and that genetics tube that was saved for future use for genetic studies of aging. Then we also got capillary blood, which is blood from a little fingertip. You did a puncture and you get a little bit of blood for hemoglobin, which is malnourishment, undernutrition, and glucose, which is diabetes. And so that's what we're looking for. And then in performance, people are asked to measure their strength of their grip, the strength, which is upper body muscle strength. Gait speed, which is walking, as you see the gentleman there walking, is how long it takes them to walk, and that measures lower body strength. And blood pressure, which is see the lady taking the blood pressure. Now the other subsample, and I'm going to say that all of these data are available. The genetics, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're doing with that. It was stored since 2012, and now we're beginning to use it in collaboration with other colleagues. Now, in the 2015 study, we also took a subsample. This is a separate R01 for those of you who understand that. It's a separate grant that we got to conduct this study, in which we took a subsample of 2015 and go back in 2016 for what is called the MEXCOG, the Mexican Cognitive Aging Study. So we took those eligible, age 55 or more in the MHAS 2015, who had conducted a direct interview or who had to do a proxy interview because they were too sick or too unable to do it directly. And we conducted two things: a target subject interview, which is an in-depth cognitive assessment, like I said, for 60 minutes, which is a combine of computer and paper, and the adequate informant, which is an interview of a relative or care provider for 20 minutes. And this is not, I don't pretend that you read this, but this is the comparison of the cognitive assessment that we conducted. And what you have here is the content of our battery, our instrument of cognitive assessment, but this is what the US applied. In the HRS, they took also a subsample, and they call it the HCAP also, and they applied this content, and this is our content. So you can, and sorry, this is in Spanish, that's in English, but it's basically the same. Everything was the same, they are lined up, and here's where we didn't line up. They didn't apply that. We didn't apply this. And then from here is country specific. We decided to do some more studies. So for us, for example, and these are just lined up to say the basic is the core assessment to detect dementia. The next is an assessment for detection of mild cognitive impairment, so which is the blue content. And then the green content is when we want to look at more advanced assessments, and this is what we did. And for us, there was an interest on lead content in dishes. So we asked for whether they use certain kinds of dishes in Mexico. Depression, we did both. And history of head trauma in Mexico. They were interested in these two things, lead and head trauma. So those were the exercises we did. So this was a very harmonized effort between the HRS and us, so that we each both would conduct our studies in very similar protocols and with very similar contents. And I should say that not only did we do it in the US and in Mexico, funding was provided also to do it in India, China, South Africa. And I believe that's it. Yeah. So the two countries that have finished are the US and Mexico. We completed it. And South Africa also completed the exercise, so it's a much smaller sample. So what's the update on us on this cognitive assessment? We completed the fieldwork in 2016. We completed the data cleaning, the codebooks and documentation. We're doing this right now. The definition of impairment needs to be still done, but we are finishing our criteria and the implementation of the data, and each country has to do it, and then we'll compare our notes or how we did it. But then the idea is, imagine that you have the subsample in which we did the detailed cognitive impairment and cognitive assessment, and you have the full sample of the MHAS in which we conduct a shorter cognitive assessment. So we're in a crosswalk between the small sample and the full sample. So in that way, it's called equipercentile. So you look at what percentile each person falls in the small sample versus where they fell in the large sample, and then you can estimate prevalence of dementia in the whole sample. So that's the exercise that we're all going to conduct in harmonization, right? The 4 or 5 countries. And we also plan to validate the cognitive instrument, which was applied in Mexico, to see whether a clinician confirms the predictions of the instruments. So what's the sample size that we came back with? People who have both cognitive and informant are 1,800, only informant and only cognitive also, for a total of 2,200. Just a very brief announcement of what else we have. In addition to the data sets of the survey, we have linked files with administrative data at community level. Mexico doesn't have a unique ID, so we are not born with an ID that we carry through our lives. So it's very hard to find you in a health record or in a social security record or any administrative records or a death registration. So the only thing we have is to be able to aggregate at the level of county or at the level of state level. And so what we have done is this is the health insurance affiliation that I was talking about that started in 2002. We've done it to 2012. So the survey is linked to those records. The survey is also linked to census variables in 2000 and 2010 and mortality rates across a historical series of mortality. We have very few people who've used these linkages. I don't understand very well why, but they are available. So they are mass data sometimes when the communities are very small, but the data is available. Another part of the advertisement that I wanted to do is something that I don't know if you're familiar with. It's a large project. It's a project financed by NIA, funded by NIA. It's called the Gate to Aging Project. It's a mega data repository of data to conduct study on aging across the world, and it's housed right now at University of Southern California. But it's G2 Aging. And what it tells you is what surveys are available across the HRS family surveys. And right now we are close to 40 surveys in the world. There's a digital library that tells you the survey questions by country, the search engine that tells you, helps you find comparable questions, and which variables are defined identically and which variables are defined differently. So the MHAS right now is one of 11 studies that they have included in their repository. They continue to add surveys each year, but this is the collection: China, England, the US, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, India. The SAGE is a group of several countries, including of importance Russia. SHARE is multi-country in Europe. It's about 25 countries in Europe that are included in SHARE, and TILDA is Ireland. So all these studies are comparable or somewhat comparable to the HRS types of studies, and like I said, the MHAS is one of them. What you're seeing is a great investment from the NIA. The NIH has invested in these kinds of initiatives, and so it's looking for now a payoff of all these investments. And so they're looking at, let's look at comparisons. Now we have enough data to compare trajectories of disability, mortality, and so on, cognitive deterioration, so that we can make comparisons. Okay, I didn't want to just tell you that the data is there. I wanted to show a few results so that, at least you get some flavor of results. And so I chose a few that I was able to highlight. One of them it's a press release. And I will tell you that there was a press release that sort of like lasted an hour in Mexico City. And I wanted to say that I started the press release with the first slide that I showed you also kind of, that says accelerated aging in Mexico, right? So the rest of the hour, they didn't care what I said. They just focused on Mexican aging is accelerated. And that was the headlines in the papers. So press releases, you never know what they're gonna catch. And there's many of the journals that that have applied population sciences have published work. The work, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the trends. We have a non-comprehensive list, but we can count 141 journal articles, 46 dissertations or master's thesis, and 36 chapters. It has taken off, and I think it has taken off since wave 3. And to several things. Wave 3 tells you that there's a trend, right? 2 is just a line, 3 is a curve, right? So at wave 3, every longitudinal study kind of kicks up. And so we saw that. The other thing that wave 3 had is the biomarkers. And that adds a whole bunch of people that are not in the field looking at aging. And so that added a lot of publications as well. So we are counting now, the pace has accelerated. So we're counting about 30 publications a year in the last couple of years. So we don't know what's going to happen, but it's much better than the pace that was in the past. And this just shows, because of when we went for renewal of the grant, we sort of drew what kinds of topics the people are working with. So chronic diseases is very common, cognition is common, depression is common, mortality, obesity, and anthropometrics also. Disability is also very well demanded. Social security and pension, not as much. Childhood conditions, not as much. Healthcare, migration, not as much, but we have a few publications. Now I wanted to show you, for example, what they're doing, some of the researchers. This is work from Amit Kumar, a former student in Texas, and he looked at, in the 12 years that happened between 2001 and 2012, what was the relationship between body mass index and mortality. And so when you look at the axis, in the horizontal axis is body mass index, and then this is the hazard of mortality. And right here in this circle is sort of the overweight people. So the overweight people have the lowest mortality at age 50 and older. Is it 50? Yes, 50 and over. And in the people that have the highest mortality, the people that are malnourished at age 50, the beginning, in the baseline, I'm sorry. And then mortality risk increases with obesity, but not significantly enough. So this is significantly different than that, but not this. So he finds that overweight, again, which is found in some other societies and other samples, is protective of mortality in middle age. The trajectories, as I was saying, once you have three points in time, then you can draw trajectories. So this is the adjusted 11-year trajectory of disability for Mexicans who start at age 60 at the beginning, and how are the trajectories they can draw. And what happens, of course, what we were expecting is that women would be much more disabled than men. They survive, and they survive more disabled. But also, not only it's a higher level, but also it's a steeper trajectory. These are other results that look at 2-year and 11-year mortality risk according to frailty. Frailty is a kind of gerontological concept that measures how weak you are, both in not only chronic diseases, but also disability, functionality, mobility. And so people who are starting non-frail, starting pre-frail, starting frail, that's the categories that they can build, then you can see the differentiation and how these are survival rates. Survivals are lower for those who are frail compared to those who are non-frail, and both at 2 years and at 11-year periods. Oh, and I included, after my conversation with Irma, some example of air pollution. So we look at what cooking fuel they were using for the older adults for cooking, and the primary cooking fuel is still wood or coal in 16% of the cases, and it's gas in 84%. So they're still cooking in rural areas in particular with wood or coal. In the very rural areas, this can be 40%, so it's 16% national. Joseph Sands, a former student who's now doing a postdoc at USC, but he wrote the paper and looked at the use of wood or coal and whether it has an effect on cognitive aging and cognition. And cognition can be measured in several domains, they call it. Verbal learning is one, attention is another, so you'll see results in more than one. But verbal learning is when you say a few words to them. I'm going to give you 8 words, and then you repeat them back to me. So that's just how much you can memorize things. And memory is one of the major components of cognitive aging. So you lose memory first, according to many of the studies. And so it's one of the domains. And so as you see then, these are different models that control for different things. The basic model, only age, sex, education, and so on. By the 4th model, he's adding already chronic conditions, health insurance, smoking, and so on. So he keeps adding more variables, but in all cases, that's the 0. They have lower cognitive assessments, cognitive values, if they are using wood or coal as cooking, controlling for a lot of other factors. So it looks as if there's at least an association between the fuels and cognition. Now, he looked at not only immediate recall, which is the one I just said, but also attention, which is another way of measuring is what is the date, what is the month, what is the year. Verbal fluency, tell me animals, tell me names of animals. Orientation, what is the date? Attention is another one then. So maybe you're supposed to tell a story, I'll tell you a story. But anyway, so there are 4 domains that he looked at, and in all those 4, there were significant impairment of in cognition associated with using wood or coal. Now he transformed it to see what they represent, the use of cooking fuels in terms of years of education or in terms of being older, because both years of education are protective of cognitive deterioration, and old age is associated with cognitive deterioration. So how much does cooking with those fuels represent in terms of years of education or years of age? So orientation associated with, cooking fuels associated with 3 fewer years of education or 6 more years of age for orientation, and so on and so forth. So he can see that these are all significant numbers, not just in significant coefficients, but also in terms of how much older you can be in terms of, or how less educated you can be if you're cooking with those fuels. We haven't done anything beyond that. For example, how long you've cooked with these fuels and so on. We haven't done the longitudinal aspects. Also, he did some sensitivity analysis that the journal requested for what had happened in previous waves and so on. And the studies and the results held. So this is very exciting. We're now talking about expanding this to be done with a comparison with the Indian survey, the survey from India, to see if the same results hold in India, which we think they will be, but we don't know what's the magnitude of the association. All right, now this one is it's a transition, a very interesting comparison. This compares Mexico with the US. So it took Mexico, the MHAS, and it took HRS in the US. And it looked at the 2-year between the first 2 wave transitions of disability. And so it happens that at time 1, persons who had 1 physical limitation and how they progressed in time 2. Okay, so in time 1, they had 1, and in time 2, what is the probability that they would be observed as having none, be observed as having the same 1, be observed as having 2 or more, so they worsen, or having died, or having been lost to the study or enter the nursing homes. So people after 2 years could go in any of these directions, and these are the transition probabilities adjusted by all kinds of demographic and socioeconomic characteristics and diseases. But what is the transitions that they do? And so in Mexico, 73% say they don't have the limitation anymore, 52% in the US. It's very common in studies of functionality and disability to observe recoveries. And so this has to be part of the models of transitions that you construct. For you, all of you who are interested in transitions, you have to consider recovery. And also, no change, 12% in Mexico, 20% in the US. Worse, that they presented more than 1 limitation, 13% in the US, 7% in Mexico. Death, 6% in the US, 3% in Mexico. Loss to follow-up, 7% in the US, entry into nursing homes, and in Mexico is 3.5%. This is one of those studies that you say, really? Does it look kind of odd? Why does it look odd? Well, first, death. Well, why are they dying more in the US? It doesn't seem right that they're dying more in the US. It doesn't seem right that they are more disabled and they're worsening more in the US, and so on. And so it looks like overall the picture is it's worse in the US than in Mexico. And so we're looking for many studies to confirm this, right? And they are slowly but surely, the studies that look at comparisons right now, those cohorts, are worse off in the US than in Mexico. And of course, the explanation could be survival selectivity, right? So these people who survive in the United States are weaker. More of them survived. And so that's why more of them will die, and more of them will be weaker. And in Mexico, only a few survived. And so the ones who survived stronger. Remember, way in the beginning, I said, that's a very interesting question. We don't know if you're going to arrive weaker or if you're going to arrive stronger. So it looks as if the ones that arrive are arriving stronger. But this is a puzzle for us. So more of them are dying because they're arriving, more of them in weak condition. So that's one of those that we're asking more people to tell us more, tell us more. Colin Payne is doing a paper in which he's looking at compression of disability, whether across cohorts, the cohort that started in 2001 and then the cohort that started in 2012, whether the disability versus mortality is expanding or compressing. And he's finding, comparing the US and Mexico, something consistent with this. that is compressing in the United States, but it's expanding in Mexico. So what we expect is that this will change. This will change. As soon as the cohorts are not as selected, this pattern should change and start looking more like this, right? That's what we would expect. Successive cohorts in Mexico should be healthier and healthier, or more of them should survive, perhaps arriving weaker and weaker. So then they will arrive and to do a pattern like this. So that's an open question. Yeah.
What are the percentages of no limitations at the start?
We have similar slides in the paper for starting with 0, starting with 1, starting with 2, and I didn't bring the starting with 0. But it's about 30% that have some limitation.
30% in Mexico, in the U.S.?
30% in Mexico. And I don't know in the U.S., can't tell you. But yeah, right. So the whole picture has to be put together when you put the 1, the 2s, the 0s, right? To put the whole picture together. But the conclusion of the paper is that overall the pattern was very similar, and so that's why I chose only 1. But yeah, right. It's a good point. So as I was saying, for us, looking at cross-national comparisons is very exciting because we can start to disentangle some of these questions, like how are these cohorts aging? How are the future cohorts going to look like? Maybe some of these patterns can tell us that. And it's the entrance to tell you that, yes, we are looking forward to cross-national comparisons on research. The HRS started in 1992. I'm going to show you the family. The MHAS in Mexico started in 2001. We were the first ones, so we're the oldest sister. ELSA in England started in 2002. Puerto Rico did a couple of waves in 2002 and 4. Share with the 20-some countries in Europe that are, I believe now 26 started in 2004. Costa Rica started in 2005, but also discontinued after 2 waves. South Korea started in 2006. Japan is in 2007. Indonesia in 2007. Ireland in 2010. China, very important for its size, started in 2011. And LASI in India started in 2012. So we have a large family of studies that can be compared. I know we like to see trajectories and so on, so that we see at least 3 waves on each of these things. But Brazil is the youngest sister that just conducted a study in 2015. So we are hoping to add more in the family and the studies that are comparable so that we can conduct these kinds of comparisons. So in summary, I wanted to highlight the research opportunities that we see. This is a study on aging in a developing country with the characteristics that I said at the beginning, and also with very important reforms that happen over the life of the panel. Susan Parker, which you might know also from this center, she's been a visitor of this center many times and works with Jerry. So she just completed a paper of the impact of the healthcare reform on the aged, looking at the 4 first waves, and she finds some impact on preventive care and treatment care of the healthcare reform. And we're looking, of course, to longer periods of time to study more of the effects, perhaps until we can study mortality. The new samples, like I said, when we add cohorts in 2001, in 2012, and then again in 2018, that allows comparisons across cohorts that I was talking, like the exercise that Colin Payne is doing, by looking at the ones who entered in 2001, age 50 to 59, and then how they died, versus the ones who entered in 2012 and how they died. And then he's comparing with the US. And of course, like we said, now we have 4 waves so that you can study trajectories and enough mortality that you can study last year of life and costs of death and so on. The content is all socioeconomic and health, and now it's very fashionable to be talking of psychosocial and biomarkers. So, and I say fashionable also only because the study has moved, the field has moved in that direction, right? So personality, conscientiousness, loneliness are beginning to be parts of the aspects that we need to study in all of these. And also the perceptions, how they feel, the manifest the stress as opposed to just the stressors, right? And how they feel about how their children are helping them as opposed to just how much help they receive. And so it's all about perception as well as the objective markers. In biomarkers, it's all about the objective markers as well as the self-reported glucose and so on. And I asterisk two things. Cognitive aging and cross-national comparisons, because we're just coming back from the meeting that all the sister studies have in Washington, and we are being said there is, you all know, a lot of funding for cognitive aging. We're going to try to defeat dementia. We're going to try to get to prevention of dementia, and so they're throwing a lot of money at us. And the idea is that we have the data, we're gathering more and more data, so cognitive aging is becoming very, very popular. And the other thing is the cross-national comparisons, like I said. You see a finding like fuel and consumption and the consequences on cognition. You find it in Mexico. Well, you want to just wonder, well, is this just because of the way you collected the data in Mexico or because of the setting in Mexico, or is it true universally? So can we add one or two more countries, and then it will be a finding, right? A universal global finding that we can say for aging patterns this is important, right? And so these two are being said, encouraged for all of us to take a look at very carefully. So we want a very innovative work around this, knowing that you know all of that, right? And so you can have cognition alone, but it's not worth as much if you don't have all of these. And you can have cross-national comparisons, but if it's just one cross-section, it's not as valuable. So now when you put it all together, you have the great stimulus, I think, the stimulating aspects of it. It's longitudinal, it's cross-national, it has all these aspects in it. They're innovative, I think, in the sense that this is where the study is moving. Now, what are the current plans? As I said, we got funding for Wave 5 and Wave 6, which are going to be conducted in 2018 and 2021. The funding is binational, so NIH provides some funding, and the National Institute of Statistics in Mexico provides some funding. So very interesting dynamic. So we go to Mexico and say we got the U.S. funding, and we go to the U.S. and say we got the Mexico funding, and so it's a nice game that we play, but it works so far. So what is new in Wave 5? In 2018, we're going to add environmental health. So it was begun to see that we were going to move on that in that area. We're going to add survey questions to environmental health, like the cooking is already there, but some other markers that they have in the environmental health specialists on outside of the household and inside of the household survey questions. We're going to link the data with monitoring stations for air pollution. We piloted that already, and it works somewhat for depending on where the monitoring stations are. And we are going to gather a subsample now with hair. And so we're looking at exposure to metals. They're very interested in lead and magnesium, and other metals. So they're going to measure it in hair. We're also looking at mortality validation. This is a study dear to IRAM in Alberto Palloni, who are contributing here. And we're going to look at whether those deaths, those losses to follow up across the panel, some of them could be deaths, but we just don't know it. We lose the contact and we don't know if they're dead. So we're going to try to match those losses to follow up with the vital registration records. Like I said, without a unique ID, this is one of those, well, let's try exercises. So we're going to see. But again, the Statistical Bureau in Mexico that does this survey is also the one that does vital registration. So we're kind of having the inside people working on it. And also exciting is there's another proposal, another R01 proposal that is under NIH review right now with the genetics group in Top Institute in Columbia in New York. And they want to do genetic analysis of Alzheimer's in Mexico. And the idea would be that in wave 5, everybody age 60 and over would give a saliva sample. You spit on a little thing, and you tap it and take it. And you look at the genetics. They can get a complete WAS out of there. And we're going to look at also apply another in-depth cognitive evaluation in a subsample in 2019. So this is under a new grant. If we get it funded, we would do this. If not, then the plan is to move it to 2021. So we'll see if this is doable. We're very optimistic. It's a good group. It's a good proposal. So we'll see. Okay, it's exciting for all of us. But see, now the study has become this thing that where you hang things from it, and everything that comes at us, it seems exciting, seems important, seems interesting. Then we add it to the study, we incorporate it, and it has its own life now. So in conclusion, I'm sure I've said all of these, but I wanted to make sure I did. So now the MHAS has become a valuable data tool for aging research, spans over 14 years. At the end of 2021, we would have followed the cohort 20 years. And so that's about a pretty good outcome. Multiple themes that are changing over the life cycle. The subsamples, who knows what the next waves are going to cover, depends on what comes up in the field. We can conduct mortality studies, no question right now. It's going to be much better in the future, but it's already pretty good right now. And it's highly comparable with other global studies. So like I said, NIH is very interested in capitalizing in those investments that they've done. We can now say, okay, we have 3 waves, enough of waves in national studies, so let's start analyzing the data. And so that's the conclusion. I wanted to acknowledge UTMB is my university. The National Institute of Statistics in Mexico is a major donor and contributor. The National Institute of Geriatrics in Mexico is heavily involved. They organize meetings. It's nothing in our budget, but they have meetings in Mexico that we always hold. The National Institute of Public Health is the ones that do all the biological biomarkers, blood, analyzing whatever we have to analyze is the National Institute of Public Health. Wisconsin is Alberto Palonis, who's retired and going into retirement, but still in Wisconsin. And UCLA is listed because Iran Beltran is in UCLA, so he's now a collaborator of the study. And like I said, MHAS is funded by both Mexico and the US, and MexCog, the cognitive part, was funded by the NIA. So I think that's all I had. So
thank you. For questions?
Yeah, the Tarahumara Indians in the Copper Basin of Mexico have a remarkable longevity. They have virtually no diabetes, heart disease, cancer, no dementia, no crime, no drug addiction, no depression. They're most famous for their athleticism. They've been known to run up to 200 miles nonstop. Are you familiar? Is anybody here familiar with that?
I know.
what region? Is it the north?
Copper Basin, northern Mexico.
Is it Coahuila, Chihuahua? What states do you know?
Mexico.
Yeah, but is it Chihuahua state? No, okay. Yeah, no, I'm not familiar. I was telling Irma that way at the beginning, we gave up on representing indigenous populations because it's hard to go and find them, but we were saying we need a special study for indigenous populations. We probably have to apply the study in their dialects and not in Spanish and so on, and the question would be very different, so we'd probably have to conduct a different study. But yeah, that's a very interesting population for longevity purposes.
Yeah,
we think they're...
It would be a model of what's possible for the
Right.
rest of Mexico.
Yep, right. But one of the characteristics of long history, longevity, is in populations, I don't know if you're familiar with the blue zones. The blue zones have certain regions of the world where people live long years and so on, very similar to the attributes that you're saying. And one of the common characteristics is isolation. Isolation. So they've been isolated. Somebody in an island, somebody in a region where you have to go through a bridge and that's the only way, right? Or like Cuba is an example, it's been isolated from the rest of the world, and we think that's part of the reason why they
Yeah.
have very long lives.
Well, their diet is vastly different from ours.
Right.
There's no junk food.
That's right. That's right. And yeah, but once you isolate from the world, pretend you're isolated from the world and live that way, and then we can live a long life. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah.
Very good.
Pilar?
I just have a quick question. The idea of selective survival is very interesting, and I guess that you can, I mean, in that study, you probably account already for the baseline starts of the different populations in the U.S. and Mexico, but you probably can have some descriptive information just looking at the baseline, whether people at 50 years old in the U.S. and Mexico, they look very different or not, and do you have some evidence of that being true?
Yeah. No, I cannot tell you with, I mean, of course we have the statistics, but I can't tell you that it was completely worse in the U.S. But you're right, some of these studies, what they're missing, and that one is one, they're not corrected for selectivity, for survival selectivity, which they could, right? Yeah. Thank you.
You mentioned about the monitoring stations for environmental health.
Yes.
So could you elaborate a little bit more on that, because people move and sometimes it's difficult.
Right, right. So the monitoring stations, that's where they measure air pollution, right? And they have a station in whatever, one city or another. And so you kind of have to measure where they live, and you know how long they live there, right? There are questions also about whether they, in large cities, for example, whether they spend a lot of their time at home or away from home. So we kind of have to get at that. I'm thinking that the environmental people are going to get at that. Like, how many hours a day do you spend at the house, where this exposure is about, right? And so on. But yeah, so you have to measure, like, how long have you lived here and how many hours do you spend here, right? Yes.
I think we are
sorry.
out of time, so maybe you can take a catch.
Sure.